Hello. Uh, I'm very excited about this week's podcast. Sue has been telling me forever and a day that I needed to talk to the team in Scotland who organise RALF about action learning. So, action learning is a form of many-to-one coaching where a group of people get together and everyone in the group asks insightful questions of the person who's brought a thing to think about. So it's kind of upside down coaching. So many people noticing, asking the questions, offering, one person bringing the thing. And it absolutely escalates the capacity for us to learn new things because we're being listened to times 6 or 5 or 8 or whatever, however many other people are in the room. And there's a coaching style used you to hold the group, to facilitate the group. And you may have been on our Action Learning Set Facilitator training, and if you haven't, have a look because it teaches you in the equivalent of a day to be able to do that, and it's great development and training. And Sue is fabulous at running it. So in this week's episode, I finally managed to get them all in the room together with me and tell us a bit about what they're doing at RALF using action learning to support people in residential childcare. And it's absolutely fascinating. And it's just fascinating and a really useful thing, and some really deep learning from these lovely people who are trying to make a difference around using restraint with children. So it's a different kind of episode today. And I am really looking forward to hearing your insights, comments, and questions. So do email us at info@3dcoaching.com. And also give us a shout if you'd love to join the next Action Learning Set Facilitator training hosted by the inimitable Sue, who trained Laura, Sarah, and Gemma, who are guests today. So over to you.
You're at the Coaching Inn, 3D Coaching's virtual pub, where we enjoy conversations with people who are engaged in the world of coaching.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Coaching Inn. Sue Blanche did some work with Strathclyde University around RALF and kept saying to me, you must have the RALF team in to come and have a podcast. So here they are, Laura Steckley, Sarah Deeley, and Gemma Watson. Welcome to the Coaching Inn.
Thank you, Claire.
It's lovely to have you here. So in a minute, we're going to find all about RALF and what you're doing. But first of all, just tell us a little bit about who you are. Why don't we start with you, Laura?
Okay, my name is Laura Steckley, and I teach and do research at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, in Scotland.
Nice, thank you. And you come from somewhere else in the world, I think.
I do. I come from the western part of the United States, which my whole country's in meltdown at the moment, but yeah.
Yeah, so quite a lot of our listeners come from the States.
Okay.
So they'll be happy to hear you. Sarah.
Thanks for having us, Claire. I'm Sarah Deeley. I'm the residential childcare lead at CELCIS, which is based at the University of Strathclyde.
Nice. Well, you're very welcome, Sarah. And hello, Gemma.
Hello, Claire. Thank you for having us. My name's Gemma Watson. I'm an Improving Care Experiences consultant, and I work in Sarah Deeley's team in the residential childcare sector in Scotland.
Nice. Well, it's such a delight to have you all here. So what is RALF? I've kept seeing RALF in Sue's diary. What is RALF?
I'll start because I started a conversation with Sarah and Gemma last week about we need to make sure that we explain that RALF has action learning in it, but it also has more. And so RALF came about when the Scottish Physical Restraint Action Group was in its early stages, and we identified the need for supporting reflective space. And so we came together and co-produced the model, which is part action learning and part a more unstructured free-flowing space for people to digest the really profound impacts that the work has on them, and kind of make sense of especially the emotional component of the work. So RALF stands for Reflection and Action Learning Forum. So this is around physical restraint in residential childcare, but RALF supports the work more widely, which is caring for children and young people who, for a variety of reasons, are no longer living with their families of origin. They're living in residential childcare either for temporary periods or much longer term. And many of these children have experienced some of the most significant adversities in Scotland, often including trauma. And so the work can be very intense and very challenging for the children and young people, as well as for the adults who care for them.
Thank you. So you're putting in some support.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. That's so interesting to hear. So, Sarah, what's your role in this?
So, RALF, we love an acronym. So RALF is born from SPRAG, which Laura mentioned, the Scottish Physical Restraint Action Group. And I'm one of the facilitators alongside Laura, Gemma, and one of our other colleagues, Craig. We facilitate the Scottish Physical Restraint Action Group. It was members of SPRAG who came up with the idea and said, wouldn't it be great if we could offer a space for reflection? SPRAG's a group where we have lots of representation from lots of key partners all across Scotland. So a lot of the conversations can be quite strategic. We can try to influence policy. We sit in quite a bit about, we've got a balcony view when we're looking out across Scotland and the changes that we're trying to make in that journey towards restraint reduction. But there also needs to be a space for talking about practice issues, talking about the challenges that the sector are grappling with, talking about the real life, day in, day out, what's happening in residential childcare. So my role was to help members of SPRAG who were interested in co-designing something come together. We very much work in partnership though, Laura, Gemma and I. It's very much a team effort, but we all bring slightly different things. I've brought some knowledge of implementation and improvement work that I've done in previous roles and previous projects, and I was able to bring that into the design process.
Nice. So what does it look like, the work that you do with RALF? Gemma?
So we were really intentional. There was a pilot of RALF around 4 years ago, a small scale pilot, that there was a few facilitators trained who supported the facilitation of a few groups across Scotland. And we received some funding through the Promise Partnership around 2.5 years ago that allowed us to really pay attention to how we scale and spread the work across Scotland to a larger group and number of people. And I came in at that point when the funding was allocated, and joined such an enthusiastic group of people who it was infectious. The enthusiasm for RALF and the impact that RALF could have on people's direct practice was infectious. And I got to experience a RALF session really early in my journey, and it was a light bulb moment for me, Claire, in terms of, now I understand why people are so enthusiastic about this, but also why people need RALF in terms of their own practice and the space to reflect at depth and learn from each other. So we pulled together a group. We asked for volunteers from SPRAG to help us think about the co-design of the rollout of RALF at a national level. And we were overwhelmed with how responsive the SPRAG membership was. People who are already incredibly busy, people caring for children every day, gave up almost a whole day across 3 sessions to come together and think with us about how we roll this out to make it most impactful across the sector. And we really paid attention to some of the principles of co-design about, shared power in the room and shared decision making, and paying attention to relationships, being really relational in how to allow people to be honest about what would work for them, being really relational in our approach to how we co-designed something that was fit for purpose And we really paid attention to how the scale and spread. We trained people in small cohorts of 5 or 6 people, and we learned from that cohort to allow us, to train the next group of people, to allow it to be as slick, I suppose, and as fit for purpose as it could be for the facilitators.
Wow. So, Laura, what impact does it have?
Well, I wondered if listeners might be interested in the impacts that maybe relate more closely to the action learning part of RALF. So we collected data in a number of different ways from participants, both facilitators of the RALF forums and group members. And the changes to thinking was the strongest, like the thing that people talked about most. And there were some changes to their thinking that really looked like the action learning part of RALF had really influenced that. So, generally people talked about most that they thought more and they reflected more as a result of their experiences as part of the RALF project. But the more specific changes to their thinking had to do with one of the really overriding themes was around, like, I don't just rush in and feel like I have to fix. Now, part of that will come also from the space to be able to lean into and notice what you're feeling and what that might be telling you. And that comes from the second half of the model. But people did talk about, like, really empowering other people or feeling empowered to find their own solutions and to be a supervisor or manager who goes into a situation now thinking about what questions am I going to ask this person to support them, rather than just going in and rolling out my sleeves and fixing things myself. And so that definitely feels like it had a big impact. I think the impacts on relationships was another strong thing that people talked about, and impacts on service culture. So the data spoke to individual impacts more strongly, impacts on the way people felt, and they felt more confident, the way people were in relationship with children, young people, more empathetic with difficult behavior, and then changes to service culture around just people feeling more safe, people understanding each other better. And a couple of participants talked about reduction in incidents, and they felt like their involvement in the RALF project had a part in that. Like, we would never want to claim that RALF or SPRAG more widely single-handedly does anything. We're there to enhance the already existing efforts that are happening in an organization, and also, organizations' already existing efforts are enhancing the work of RALF. Like, it's a two-way process. But so we were really delighted, and there's a link to the report and a shortened version of the report with those impacts and the learning as well. So I think there's also learning related to implementation theory that I'd like to hand over to Sarah or Gemma.
So we'll put a link to the report in the show notes.
Thanks.
So listeners, if you want to have a read of that, just check out the show notes and it's there. So, Vera, Gemma, what else?
Well, I'll jump in and start off, Gemma, and then you can pick up. So when we paid lots of attention to training alone is not enough. We didn't want to train our facilitators and let them go and deal with really difficult, tricky situations or emotional subjects or potentially difficult groups, RALF groups and RALF sessions, and not give them the support that they need. So we've put a whole scaffolding of support in for our facilitators as they move forward. So being trained as a RALF facilitator is only one part of the project. It's only one part of the bigger process. Our facilitators over the 2-year funding period, they were given a link person. So we had an oversight group made up of people who wanted to be involved in the RALF project. They had specific knowledge and skills and qualities that made them the right people to be on our oversight group, and they would volunteer to link in with our facilitator. So every facilitator would get a hot debrief within 48 hours of facilitating a RALF session, just that emotional wellbeing check-in. How are you? How are you doing? That type of thing. Our facilitators all became part of a facilitator community of practice. So at the community of practice, it was almost a session of two halves. We would have one of the people, Sue, and one of our other trainers who trained our facilitators would come along and take part. So it was that access to ongoing support, coaching, training, mentoring, that an opportunity to test out. I tried this, I'm not very sure. Can I ask you a question about? It was a space that our facilitators never had to wait too long to get access to somebody who was able to give them a bit of advice and support. And the second half of the community of practice sessions was open reflective space, because we know we need emotional containment, particularly if you're in the role of facilitator. You're taking on the emotions and the feelings and the energies of everybody in your group. That needs to go somewhere for you to be protected and looked after. So we would have space for peer-to-peer support. Laura, Gemma and I would loosely facilitate those sessions for the second half. And we had a handbook that our facilitators could link in with. We had a Teams tile, so there was opportunity for facilitators to chat and connect. If we'd seen a link to a podcast, we would pop it on the Teams chat, people could connect that way. So we were growing that community round about, and it wasn't just training.
Such a beautiful description of the building of the scaffolding, isn't it? Because as you're talking, you can feel the scaffolding being built up and the person kind of being held in the middle in a really beautiful way. Thank you, Sarah.
That's okay.
Gemma.
Our facilitators also had the opportunity to be group members and were facilitated by the wonderful Sue. So they were held in that way, where they could bring any dilemmas or practice challenges from facilitating RALF groups into their group that was facilitated by Sue as a group member. And something else we put in terms of support for our facilitators was within their own organisations at the point of sign up. There was a loose application form for people to apply to become facilitators, and we asked for some endorsement from a senior manager within the organisation who could offer some support and just some understanding around the time that was required for training and to be a RALF facilitator and support the person within their own organisation also.
Wow. And it's really interesting as you're talking, you've kind of said but haven't said directly. There's something here about the support for people that's beyond the case. Because I'm sure they get support on the case locally, but you're talking about a different level of looking, aren't you? Does anyone want to say a little bit more about that?
And I think there's layers, and they match the layers that we know. Like if we're going to help if adults are going to be able to metaphorically hold children more effectively through relationship, through provision of nurturing processes and environments, then they need their own parallel version of that. And the people who are holding adults through the tricky bits and through the rough times also need to be held, if you will, psychologically, intellectually, cognitively, because it's all very challenging and sometimes very disturbing work. Like really painful stuff has happened to these kids. And a lot of the adults as well have painful things in their histories, some of which maybe send them on the path of wanting to help other people. And so all of that could be in a really pressure cooker type environment. And so the RALF project has those layers in mind. And it worked really well in some services, and other services, I think it was really hard for the facilitators to bring it back and implement it. And I think some of it is practical, how the competing demands just feel impossible. And I think some of it is you're asking people to go to a really painful place mentally, psychologically, and spend time reflecting and talking about things like vulnerability. People's willingness to be and ability to be vulnerable was another impact that the participants talked about, but it's experiential, and people will resist going there until they start to have positive experiences of that. And so so it's very challenging to take that away and implement it. And some services, I think the facilitators were able to do that much more effectively, and others, it was more challenging for them. And some, I think they just weren't able to embed it in an ongoing way in their service. And that there's learning from that too going forward, because the need for it is still there, even if the uptake wasn't.
Oh, interesting. So a lot about safety and vulnerability.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, whoever wants to take this question, what do you know even more now about safety and vulnerability that you didn't know when you started this project?
Yeah, I can jump in. In terms of safety and vulnerability, I think our workforce are so important for residential childcare to make a difference in the lives of children and young people. We need to look after our workforce. They are one of the key levers and the key drivers. And for them to be looked after, they need to be able to bring safety. They need to experience safety, a space where they can bring a level of vulnerability that they're okay with. And it'll look different at different times. So the vulnerability you show in your one-to-one with your direct line manager is different to the vulnerability you would show maybe in your team meetings or in direct work with children and young people. But to be able to pivot and adapt and flex and bring the appropriate level of vulnerable self to these different spaces, you need to have a good understanding of yourself. And that comes from coaching and support and good spaces and good people round about you who are able to help you make sense of that. And that comes from your senior management and your leadership teams, and it comes from the systems and structures that are in place. So we need organisations to be providing the workforce with spaces to reflect, with spaces to unpick the tricky stuff and to identify what's working well and how do we build on that. We very much throughout RALF have came from an appreciative inquiry standpoint, and Laura's led other research around appreciative inquiry as well, and we could maybe put some links to that in as well, if that was okay, Claire.
Sure.
But we absolutely try and come from a what's working well and how can we build on that. So that needs to happen within organisations, but there also needs to be bigger systems and structures in place to support the organisations to do that as well.
What a beautiful thing you've said there about supporting people to be clear what support they can get where, and how to use them differently. Because I think one of the things I observe in lots of supporting professions is that often we have more than one thing available to us, and that clarity that you're describing there of actually this is for this and this is for that is so important, isn't it? In order to get that scaffolding robust in the same way that it needs to be. Gemma, you were nodding.
Yeah, I think something that we collectively realised, Laura, Sarah and I, alongside the facilitators who were trained, was that when people are busy and the days are busy caring for children and doing that job well every day, that spaces for reflection and coaching and mentoring are sometimes put in the back burner because the priority is the day job and caring for children. But it's when people need it most, Claire, that we've heard that it's when you really need to dig deep and prioritise that space for each other as colleagues, as managers, to ensure that people get the time to reflect and be coached and mentored.
Yeah. because you can't give from an empty cup.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What an extraordinary piece of work that you're involved in. What's next?
Well, we were facing like the end of the funding period, which it ended in the spring. And the funding period was to roll out the model, and that rollout was co-produced just like the model was co-produced. And Sarah and Gemma spoke to that a bit. And so we're at this, place where there has been quite a lot of interest from services that weren't involved in the rollout, and from those services that want more facilitators. The Care Inspectorate and the Scottish Government have also been interested, and apparently the Care Inspectorate has been with some of their services when they're doing their inspection, recommending that they get involved with SPRAG, but also with RALF specifically, because of the way that other services had talked about its impacts. But we know that training isn't enough, and all the scaffolding requires resources. And so we're figuring out how to make RALF more self-sustaining for the sector in a way that it's not reliant on short-term periods of funding, although we may need another time-limited period of funding in order to find a way to make RALF something that the sector itself can sustain. So that's what we're hoping to do in the coming months. In the meantime, we're just kind of stretching. It's like what Gemma just said, with the busyness of everything, it can get pushed to the background. And it was the 2 years of promise funding that enabled us to put it front and center and do the rollout. And so we're kind of stretching our diaries and our workloads to fit in kind of continued support for those facilitators. We're not taking on any new facilitators, new services, even though there's an appetite for it, but at least a bare minimum level of sustaining support for those people who've already been part of the project and who are still going with it. But yeah, it requires a similar amount of resources to be able to put it front and center and going forward. So that's what we're working on. We have some avenues for funding that we're looking to, but also some partners that we're hoping to bring together to create something for the sector together, that then the sector, we collectively, do, rather than it being a CELCIS Strathclyde thing, which is what it's been up to now. CELCIS Strathclyde promise thing for the 2-year rollout, but from start until now, it's been CELCIS Strathclyde, and we still want to be involved, but yeah, it needs to be more sustaining more broadly.
And you've raised such an interesting point there, Laura, about things that take cash and also take enormous amounts of goodwill and resources and release of people.
Yeah.
Which is just as complicated, isn't it? And you described beautifully there, they're working on the front line. And so making the decision to release people is a tricky one. But then if you don't, it has consequences.
Yeah.
So Sarah, Gemma, what else do you notice? What are your hopes?
So at the minute, we are continuing to offer, like Laura said, we're not training any more facilitators, but we are continuing to offer a support to the facilitators who are pre-existing and have completed their training and have chosen to facilitate their groups in this interim period. So we're continuing with the community of practice, and I offer some one-to-one space to our facilitators to allow them to, it's not quite the debrief we offered before, but to give them a space to come and talk about some of the challenges and some of the highlights, some of the wonderful things about facilitating groups as well. It's a real joy just to spend time with our facilitators and hear how their groups are going. And I think we would really like to accredit something for our facilitators going forward, to maybe offer them something more robust in terms of their training. But again, that takes people and cash and all sorts of things. Yeah.
Sarah, what are your hopes?
I would love to see RALF adopted nationally in residential childcare across Scotland. That's my blue sky ambition. If to take a slight step down from my blue sky ambition, I'd love to see reflective practice prioritised more greatly. It takes resource, it does, and it takes time, but I genuinely believe it's the thing that can make the difference for our workforce and for children and young people. So it doesn't need to be RALF, but there should be some form of reflective practice available to the workforce.
So as we begin to come to an end, I think my question to you is, our listeners are from all kinds of different sectors, and I'm really curious to find out, what would you like to say to somebody who's wondering about action learning and reflective practice in their organisation? What would be your top offer? You're smiling, Laura.
I'd like this message to get across anyway, so this is a good place to do it. So in our little professional bubble of residential childcare, and the promise is a big piece of social policy around how care should be in Scotland for children and young people. And there's a big emphasis on reflective practice. And a lot of the participants in RALF and a lot of our own experiences of not just RALF, but the practice learning part of RALF was, once you experience it, and I kind of touched on this at the beginning, it's very experiential. And so understanding really what in-depth reflective practice looks like and feels like, you can't know what you don't know, right? And if you've never experienced that, and you've never worked in a place that the culture and practices of the place naturally afford that kind of development and those kind of conversations, then and a lot of our participants were like, oh, I had no idea until I was part of the RALF project. Like, I had no idea what in-depth reflection was really. Mm-hmm. And so I guess my take home is that the scaffolding that RALF provides, we talked about the scaffolding around RALF and around the facilitators, but RALF itself is really important scaffolding that enables people to reflect at depth, because we've all worked with people who they kind of think they're reflective, but they're really not. And maybe we've had our moments where we're not really reflective, but we're not very self-aware. And it requires something more than just the intention of being reflective to be reflective at the level of depth necessary for this kind of work, and maybe, well, definitely other kinds of work as well. So if people are thinking about action learning, or if they're in residential childcare in Scotland and thinking about RALF, then I would say, yeah, it's experiencing that and really takes you to a depth that, unless you are working in a place that has extraordinary levels of culture around reflection, you'll need action learning or some other form of scaffolding to really be able to do that kind of thinking, feeling work that integrates the two well, is my sense. And that's something I've learned from the whole RALF journey.
Thank you. Extraordinary levels of culture around reflection.
Yeah. I think for me, it takes practice. I think we can be reflective, but the more you practice it, the more it's a skill you can hone. And I think being part of RALF and speaking to others who've been part of RALF, it's hard for it not to seep out into other spaces. So that nurturing of reflective practice and being reflective as a group within an organisation seeps into other conversations, into supervision and team meetings, and it's infectious. And it the more it's practiced, the more it will seep into the corners of organisations and the different spaces that are created. And just taking time to prioritise people and give people what they need to be the very best version of themselves that can show up for children every day, I think has been really key.
Thank you. Isn't it interesting that when we work deeply and simply, people can copy it if they like it? We notice that in so many places across the organisations that we work with, that if it's simple, people go, oh yeah, I can do that. And yes, you need to be trained and all of those other things. But actually, there's plenty in this to borrow. And it's borrowing that changes cultures, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sarah, you have the final word.
Goodness. I think for me, I agree with what Laura and Gemma have said as well. So I'm going to try and come in with a slightly different lens here, and it's round about the implementation of change. So introducing RALF, some organisations had high levels of reflective practice or action learning set models or action learn. They had systems and structures in place. Others didn't. But no matter what level we were coming in at, we were still introducing a change in how we were asking the workforce to reflect and spend time together. And change is difficult and scary and hard and messy, but it can lead to the most wonderful things. And any form of change, any form of introduction or tweaks or adaptations that you're making to your systems and structures for reflective practice, they need to be handled carefully and thoughtfully, and it needs to be more than just that moment for reflection. You need to think about how you implement it. So what supports are you given? What's your anticipatory guidance for the staff? What's the check-ins? What's the supports? And where's your organisational buy-in, your leadership buy-in to make sure that that's going to happen? Because we've seen through RALF, and it comes up in the research as well, quite often that's where it'll fall down. If you don't have your leaders saying this is a priority and I want you to prioritise it, then that's quite often where the whole thing can fall.
Thank you so much. So links in the show notes, lovely listeners. Laura, Sarah, Gemma, thank you so much for coming to the Coaching In to talk about RALF. If anyone has questions about using it in their organisations, I'll put links to contact you in the show notes. So thank you for coming. Thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode. Bye-bye.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we'd love you to share the podcast with a friend or leave a comment on social media. And if you'd like to become a regular at the Coaching In, you can subscribe on Podbean and all major podcast channels. We look forward to welcoming you next time. You've been listening to The Coaching In, 3D Coaching's virtual pub. For more information, check out 3dcoaching.com.